Good evening. Thanks for tuning in. My name is Jarrett Murphy, and I'm the executive editor at City Limits. I'm joined this evening by Kyle Bragg, the president of SEIU 32BJ, Jennifer Jones Austin, the president and CEO of FPWA, Northwest Bronx Community and Clergy Coalition executive director Sandra Lobo, State Senator Jessica Ramos of the 13th District in Queens, and Catherine Wild, the president and CEO of the Partnership for New York City. We're here tonight because New York City is in trouble, the deepest trouble of my lifetime and maybe many of yours too. Our health is in immediate danger from COVID-19, and our future is threatened by the economic, fiscal, and cultural shockwaves of this pandemic. City Limits was launched in 1976 in the middle of the city's previous existential emergency. We were founded to document the impact of the adoption of austerity policies in the wake of that fiscal crisis, and also to chronicle the brave, smart, and creative ways that people, neighborhoods, and institutions sought to make a better world out of the ashes of that era. You can see evidence of the success of some of those efforts not far from where I'm sitting tonight in the North Central Bronx. The lessons of that era, good and bad, are why we convene this evening's conversation. Amid the understandable anxiety and worry about yesterday's school's announcement and the looming ban on indoor dining and other elements of perhaps a second pause, we've invited a group of New Yorkers deeply involved in navigating this crisis to talk about what the city's facing and what ideas, old or new, courageous or common sense, we have to embrace to save the city and maybe even improve it. And we hold this conversation as a mayoral campaign begins to unfold where these issues and ideas must be center stage. And we're going to talk about how to make that happen. But first, panelists, this crisis has been going on for a very long time. Its dimensions can be a little overwhelming. So I want our viewers to understand where each of you stand in it right now, what you've been seeing over the past month, what your members and colleagues and constituents and friends have been going through, just to give us a sense of your perspective on the crisis. Let's start with Senator Ramos. You represent an area that for a while was the epicenter of COVID-19, like in the world. What has it looked like recently? What are you seeing now?
Hey, Jarrett. Hi, good evening, everyone. Can you see and hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. I just wanted to make sure. Well, it's really been a tough time here in Northwestern Central Queens. I represent an area that does not have a hospital. Our closest hospital is Elmhurst Hospital.
Oh, we appear to have lost the senator. Hopefully we'll get her back, but let's pivot quickly to Catherine Wild. I was just rereading yesterday a report the partnership put out, I think in July, kind of assessing the situation citywide and certainly as it faced the business community. How has your picture of the city changed since then?
I'm going to defer to the senator since
she's back on.
Back.
Sorry, this was happening before where I drop off after a few moments, so I guess I just have to speak faster. But we have gone through a really tough time. Of course, the fact that 5 of our hospitals here in Queens closed over the past 20 years set us up for a very precarious position. We ended up losing well over like 1,500 of our neighbors, many of them breadwinners, leaving some of our most vulnerable, low-income working families.
Ouch. All right. Well, we will move on and hope the senator can establish a stronger connection. Obviously, that is proof perfect of the fact that life online does not replace life in the city that we knew before COVID. And on that same theme, Catherine, talk about the picture from your perspective at the partnership. Obviously, we know it's grim. How has it changed, for better or for worse, in terms of contour since the summer?
So we put out a report on July 20th, at which point early in the summer, the city unemployment rate was 20%. It's gone down to 14%. We're still double the rest of the country. And in the month of August, 166,000 New Yorkers dropped out of the unemployment line, out of the labor force. So you've got the unemployment rate may say 14%, but it's higher than it was. And so that's a problem. Number 2, we've got a second phase of a resurgence of the coronavirus. We said in June, as we entered phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, to come back, that the worst thing that could happen to us from both a health and an economic standpoint was to have a recurrence. We saw that starting in Europe about a month ago, and we're about a month behind. So that's that's got a huge impact. And we're relooking at, we had numbers like the city's economy was going to be down 13.5 billion this year. It's going to be down more than that now. Not sure how much more until we see how this phase plays out. Obviously, this has a disproportionate impact on low-wage workers, people who are in neighborhood retail in particular, and who have lost their jobs and have no place to go. It's got a particular impact on certain industries, obviously, the arts, entertainment, tourism, travel, etc. The world that I mostly work with, the financial services industry, the major corporations, the largest employers, have been working remotely for the last 8 months. And as a result, they've been able to keep the economy going. But at the same time, the fact that they're remote is bad for everybody else. So we're all in this together situation, and it continues to be challenging. And I'm afraid the health crisis happened quickly and slammed us, as the senator started to say, deeply. The economic crisis is rolling out much more slowly, and I don't think we've seen the worst of it yet.
Before we go back to the senator, Catherine, was it your sense that before the second wave really hit, were businesses beginning to kind of claw their way back? Was there the start of a recovery brewing and now it's been stymied, or were we still dwelling in the doldrums altogether?
No, there was great energy around the phased reopening, both by business and the nonprofit sector, and there was real investment. Everybody put their last dime into trying to make sure that they had the outdoor dining, and they were fixing the ventilation, and obviously that happened in the school system, et cetera. So no, there was real energy. This is a reversal of a momentum that we all know in our own lives. When we've worked real hard to get someplace and suddenly we're reversed, it's tough. And I don't think anybody can gloss that over. This is the worst possible thing that could happen to us.
Senator Ramos, let's try one more time for you to finish your thought about what you're seeing there in Elmhurst, in your district, in terms of a very hard-hit area several months after it passed out of the headlines. What are you seeing?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. And apologies. I've now changed devices, so I should be fine now. But, what we're starting to see is a lot of worry around the second wave starting and the lack of testing. We are seeing a lot of rapid testing going on and starting to understand that there are a lot of false positives out there. That's not necessarily contributing to the actual lack of transparency we're getting from the city in terms of contact tracing data and where the real vectors of infection lie. We actually don't think that the schools are primary places where infections are happening, but we're creating the conditions for forcing a lot of these small businesses, particularly restaurants with indoor dining, where the infections can proliferate, to have to keep operating because we're not able to provide any financial support for New Yorkers to stay home and take a real pause. And that's what has us really worried, because the economic conditions here are very difficult. I got to hear Kathy start to say that in a lot of these industries, people haven't received not only a paycheck in a while, but weren't able to qualify for unemployment benefits, didn't get a stimulus check. This of course includes undocumented people, but also people who were formerly incarcerated and didn't have the employment history to qualify for any of these benefits, and many other industries like street vendors, sex workers, people who are part of the cash economy in New York that we love to ignore, but actually make significant contributions to our tax base and our New Yorkers nevertheless. So I'm here and happy to join this cohort, largely because we do have to think about how it is that we're going to generate revenue. We can pray and throw as many temper tantrums as we need to in order to get the federal funding that we need, but it's not going to be enough, likely, and we don't know when it's going to arrive. Based on conversations I've had, it seems like the soonest it would arrive would be in the spring, and by then it'll be a year since we've been in this pandemic. And my
I want
neighbors
to come back to
can't
that.
take
Definitely want to come back to the revenue question because that's a big one. But I want to bring in our other guests before we get to that. Kyle Bragg, I was just reviewing today a video you sent out to your members, I think on March 17th, which of course seems like about 6 years ago, in which you kind of prepped them for what was going to happen, talked about the importance of making sure owners and abided by their contracts. What has this looked like for unionized workers, this crisis? And what are you thinking about now as we move apparently into the second wave?
Well, I'd start by saying it's been very difficult for our members who are essential workers who have been part of that. The essential workers have helped keep the city running. And I also would highlight the fact that we have a very good partnership and working relationship with the industry. Our members have early on been given the PPE and all the and we work very closely with the industry to create protocols that allow them to continue to provide these valuable services. It was difficult early because when in the first few months of this pandemic, we lost 138 of our members to this COVID crisis, and that happens so rapidly because no one obviously was prepared for what had befell our city, but the world. Our members had to continue to go to work. They had to continue to provide the services. As we sheltered in place, it was our members that made life bearable for thousands and thousands of New York City residents who live in apartment buildings across the city. Our members continue to safeguard buildings in this city as security officers. Our members continue to work in schools to make sure that those environments are safe for our children. And so, as we got a handle on the pandemic, in the sense that we want to make sure that as all essential workers want to be ensured that they had proper safety protocols, that they had proper PPE, that they could continue to provide the valuable services, and having a good relationship with an industry that thought about safeguarding not only providing the services but safeguarding their workers. We've been able to do that and sustain it. And now we're in the second stage, which is hitting our members hard as well, because we've been able to. I think Kathy mentioned it, that there are many people who have been working remotely. That's great, but part of that means that they're not in our commercial buildings. That we have not been able to get back to above 10% occupancy in commercial buildings, and the Department of Labor has instituted a program called Shared Work, which allowed a lot of our commercial building workers to continue on in their jobs with the cooperation of the industry who participated in that. But now that's expiring, and we don't know what's going to happen now in the second wave, and whether or not, as we've seen some momentum, it's people returning back to office space, now that's being pulled back. And so, unfortunately, I'm very concerned that there's going to be a population of our members will be back to unfortunate furlough situations or laid off, and we are hoping that we get a grip on this and contain it again. And I think that there's been responsibleness by government in the handling of this crisis, but it is what it is, and our members have been very dedicated to providing, again, essential services that have been needed in this crisis.
Thanks. Jennifer Jones-Austin, the city's human services sector, the nonprofit sector, provides such critical help in the best of times, and obviously it's been part of the response to this crisis. We're on the verge, or maybe in the midst of the second wave. Do you feel like that sector is capable of stepping up to help the city in this next phase? Does it have those resources, or are we talking about, a system that's kind of on the brink?
So, good evening. Good to be with all of you. When you use the word capable, my first thought is, yes, they are capable. Now, are they supported to deliver what they need to deliver to the communities that are greatest in need? That's another question. They are very capable, but they're not funded. at the levels that they need to be funded. One of the greatest challenges that we experienced at the onset of COVID-19 was the lack of an appreciation that the human service agency workers are essential workers too. We struggled to get PPE equipment for them. I'm talking about the individuals that had to get up and still go and serve as home health aides, the individuals that were still performing child care services, were still there providing child welfare case management services, domestic violence services. For some reason or another, the city, the state, and others didn't want to see them as essential workers if they were working in community-based organizations. So we struggled to get them critical PPE supports. We struggled to get other supports, when they had to go online and provide services remotely, meet with clients remotely. We had to get the approvals that were slow to come from the city and the state to make that happen. Do they have the capability? Yes, they have. They do. Are they supported? Is another question. The challenge that we have going forward is that there are many more people who are now in need. And so when you ask about capability, the need has only grown. Yes, the unemployment rate has gone down, but for the lowest income New Yorkers, the ones who work in the tourism and the retail industry where the jobs have been slow to return, they're the ones who are still struggling. Black Americans, brown Americans, low wage workers are still struggling. And so the need is still there. Food insecurity is still at a high. Concerns around emergency assistance for rent, to keep people in their homes, those needs are still great. And so is capability, are they capable of doing it? Yes, but they're not being supported. The other concern that I have in this moment is when I look at the jails and the fact that we're seeing an increase in jail population, and the fact that, with this budget crisis that we're now in the middle of, caused by COVID, we've got fewer resources in the jails. And so I'm concerned about overcrowding. The city did a great job of getting people who didn't need to be in our jails out, but now those numbers are going back up. And the other thing that I see from my vantage point that I think that the human service agencies and others need to be leaning in and looking at is what is happening with faith communities who are losing resources as well. And they sometimes they act like human service organizations, providing critical services in the moment for people who are in need. And they're struggling financially because of COVID. And the surge is only going to cause that struggling to continue all the more.
So Sandra, the area that you look after in the Northwest Bronx, it's not Wall Street. It's not where there were a lot of commuters coming in every day to work. It's probably not one of the areas that's lost a lot of residents to the Hamptons. What has the crisis looked like there, like over the past month or so? What are you seeing? Is it different from March and from June and July? Is it all the same? What's the picture there?
Yeah, good evening, everyone. It's good to be here with you. So the Northwest Bronx Community and Clergy Coalition, we were started in 1974 in response to redlining and disinvestment. And we work towards racial justice and economic democracy through intergenerational organizing. And it's interesting that we're having this conversation right now because in your intro, Jerry, you talked about, just how the city was when City Limits started. And that's kind of, where we're at today. I think it's important for us to just note that here in the Bronx, we felt like we were already in crisis before COVID hit, being the county with the worst health outcomes in New York State, with the highest rates of eviction and housing insecurity, with both residential and commercial tenants being pushed out with rezonings. I think that the pandemic just shed light on and exacerbated a lot of the existing inequalities in our boroughs. So, at one point we were labeled the epicenter of the epicenter, right? Because we had the highest rates of infection and deaths in the entire city. Our hospitals were over capacity, as the senator shared, that we experienced that very much here too. And our nurses and other frontline workers did not have the PPE that they needed, or even the safe staffing. And today that is still an issue, right? We stood with NYSNA today for the March of Our Lives, where we have nurses still asking for the PPE and the safe staffing that they need to provide for communities. And many of our tenant association meetings before we were organizing around housing issues, many of them actually turned into vigils, right, for the community members that we lost during the pandemic. We have today, most of the evictions in the city, we have the highest pipeline of evictions in all of the city, and our community members were already rent burdened and harassed by landlords. So we're really concerned about, that we have one of the biggest homelessness crisis looming and headed our way. And then just in regards to economic development or the crisis that we're seeing facing our community, the Bronx had the least amount of federal PPP loans at only 3%, and only 1% of New York City small business services funding for the Bronx. And so what we saw was tenants struggling, small businesses struggling with a housing crisis compounded by a health crisis compounded by an economic crisis. And so we've been, organizing with partners, labor, and other community organizations to start thinking about alternative community-led solutions in response to this current moment.
So we're in this moment, now we need to think about paths forward, and the topic that came up earlier is a big one. That's the question of federal aid that's obviously been hanging over us for months. Would it come? What it would look like? We now know, even though the occupant of the White House doesn't seem to know, we now know who the next president's going to be. We have some idea of what the federal legislature will look like, although that is a bit muddy. I guess the question is, what can New York City expect relative to its needs, and when might it expect it? Catherine, what are you hearing or thinking about that? What kind of a federal relief package can we hope for?
I was on the phone yesterday with Senator Coons, who does not think we're going to get anything before the end of the year because of the dysfunction in Washington that continues. They are and everything then depends on 2 Georgia Senate seats as to what we can expect next year, because if the Senate is still an obstacle, it is going to be very hard for cities and states to get the kind of money they need. We need, the Senator Schumer is still supporting the HEROES Act numbers, where at least $500 billion for cities and states and a lot more for hospitals and other areas, additional round of PPP, more help for individuals. That package would, again, was constructed last June when we thought this was over after 3 months. So I think the senator's point that whatever we get is going to be inadequate is where we have to start from.
Senator, you were suggesting before that federal aid would not be adequate, and I think you were perhaps thinking of a different revenue mechanism as you mentioned that. So talk about that. Why do you think that even under the best case scenario, you don't think the feds will make us whole?
No, I do not think the feds will make us whole. But I do think that there is, of course, value in keeping hope alive and in continuing to advocate for those dollars. We can't give up the fight. What I'm saying is, and it sounds like Kathy agrees, we're not going to be getting that money during this presidency. And then once the next presidency begins, it's likely going to take a little while, if any, considering that as of right now, we're assuming that there will be a GOP-led Senate. That will be a tremendous hurdle to overcome. And again, I doubt that we'll be getting the funding for absolutely everything that we need. If we start, counting off hazard pay, the MTA, our healthcare services, fully funding our public schools, making sure that our kids, especially our children who are homeless, have access to learning devices and Wi-Fi. We need to make sure that people are fed. We need to avert evictions in this state. I mean, the list is billions and billions and billions of dollars, and the federal funding is not likely going to cut it. And in my opinion, the governor has been twiddling his thumbs for the past 9 months now, and hasn't really offered any proposals to generate revenue. I have my proposal. I believe that billionaires should be taxed and should be paying their fair share. That is who has the money. Federal government has money. Billionaires have money. Working class New Yorkers, zero money. Small businesses, zero money. So we got to look at where the money is and we need to make sure that it's flowing back to our economy. Since they're not doing so voluntarily, then we are happy to help them make sure that there's more money coming into the state so that we can pay for the services that we need, because this is the time to invest in people, not to keep insisting on austerity politics and austerity budgeting that has only driven us and our services into the ground. There's a lot of work to do, but we have to be adamant. And I know, Kathy and I don't agree on taxing billionaires, but we do need to figure out then how it is that we're going to generate this revenue. Legalizing marijuana is not going to be enough. Pre-pandemic, the estimate on that was $250 million a year. We're in a $16 billion deficit right now at the state level. So we're going to have to get creative, and we need those who are actually profiting off of the loss and the grief of our families to do their fair share. And at the end of the day, they made a $77 billion profit over the pandemic, over the course of the pandemic thus far. All I'm asking for is a third of that. They can keep being billionaires, and the rest of us can eat.
So yeah, other revenue tools, legalizing marijuana may not close the budget gap. It may make us feel better about it. Catherine, she's teed you up to give the counter argument for that. Why is that a bad idea at this point to incrementally ask the wealthiest New Yorkers to pay more, given the depth of the crisis?
Well, first of all, I quarrel with the idea that our billionaires have profited off of the pandemic. I don't think that's true, and they certainly have been among the most generous philanthropists supporting the not-for-profit and other communities, and the undocumented workers who they helped get some cash when nothing was available through the various immigration groups and Domestic Workers Alliance, et cetera. So I think that's an unfair characterization. My concern is that we have seen 300,000 people change their address. Those tend to be the better off people who are the higher taxpayers. And what we can't afford to do is lose money in the process. So I think that anything that demonizes a population that has the easy option of moving out of town is going to cost us money, not gain us money. The other thing is, I think we've got to be more creative about looking where the revenue, other options. The senator has a bill that I very much support that I think could bring us over $1 billion a year in terms of the state taking over self-insurance of title insurance. And I think that's a very rational approach that she and I agree on to raising revenue as quick as we can do that. I think the fact that we haven't had a gas tax increase for more than 3 decades suggests that that's an area that we ought to absolutely be looking at. I know I'm paying more for a gallon of gas or less for a gallon of gas today than I did 40 years ago. And I think that's another area. So I think there are things that we can look at that can raise revenues, and that we should be doing that together. I also think there are ways that we can redirect resources from areas where they're not as important to areas where they can make a difference. So I think that's a conversation we have to have. I totally agree with her that it will not be enough to wait for Washington to bail us out.
Before we move into other new ideas, I want to check something that the senator talks about. I want to dig into it more. That's the MTA. And obviously that faces maybe the most acute, visible fiscal crisis. But there's a deeper crisis there, which is that's driven by the lack of ridership in recent months. And one of the questions is, are those people ever going to come back? And Kyle, I think this goes to something you were talking about is, your workers in office buildings, whether those office occupants are ever going to return at the level that they used to, because so much of our economy revolves around that. What's your instinct on that? Do you think we're going to get back to the pre-pandemic office culture in New York, or have things changed kind of dramatically? Are we in an entirely different phase of life in the city?
I don't think we'll ever get back to what we would perceive as normal pre-pandemic. Through this pandemic, people have learned to work differently, but I don't want to think about it in the way of doom and gloom. I think that people will return to office space. I just think that because of this crisis, companies have learned to work a little different. And it's my great hope that people will find the confidence. And I think that's the work that my members do every day, is to build confidence that these buildings are safe for people to return to. We've created these incredible safety protocols for them. Our members are cleaning high-touch spaces every single day. They're making these buildings as safe as they can be, and with the anticipation that people will see that the industry is taking this seriously and has acted responsibly, and our members are at the forefront of that work. And so I don't want to think about a doom and gloom scenario that we will not return to that. I actually believe that we will. I think that people are anxious. Actually, there's a lot of people that's anxious to get back into that space, and we're doing everything that we can in conjunction with the industry to make that possible and make people feel safe and comfortable in doing so.
Show of hands among people on the panel. Just curious, who is back in their office with their staff?
Thanks to 32BJ.
We're part-time.
Part-time,
right.
Yeah, same thing. Jennifer, I know you wanted to talk. I just wanted to, if I could, mention that FPWA has this great tool that I think is really, really germane to what we're talking about, the austerity tracker, which is looking at the impact of cuts years and years at the federal level and their impact specifically on the human services sector. But I think it's really relevant because obviously we think about the fiscal crisis of the 70s, the austerity that ushered in, and we're talking now about, under the best case scenario, probably having to tighten belts in the city and the state. Mayor de Blasio has talked about potentially borrowing money to avoid some of that. What do you think should guide the city's decisions strategically about where it cuts and where it spends, knowing that most likely, at least for the next few months, maybe the next few years, the money is going to be tighter? How does the city approach those decisions?
Well, the greatest challenge that we have is that the approach the city has taken is to look at where they have greatest control over the money, right? The city tax levy dollars. And what the city tax levy dollars do is they fund unmandated services, particularly when it comes to social services. Our greatest concern has been that at the federal level, we saw a cut of $9 billion over the course of about 11 plus years now to human services. And then we've seen a 27% cut from the state level for human services over the last 2.5 governors' terms. And now we see here at the city that the first thing it did when it began losing money because of COVID, they started cutting unmandated services that help those most in need. So the challenge that we have right now is helping the city to appreciate, getting the city, getting the state and the federal government to appreciate that if we do not invest in our individuals and families who are struggling the most, as you know, Kathy Wild and the partnership, and I guess it was better than 160 business partners helped the city to understand, we need to support essential workers, some of them at the lowest pay, to get back and going, because we all need them. If the city and the state don't take the approach that everybody matters in this moment, and that we have to invest in, the people who are struggling the most, then this is just going to spiral further and further and further out of control. We're going to see greater homelessness. We're going to see greater increases in people being evicted, causing homelessness. We're going to see greater increases in food insecurity. We're going to see children and families, being engaged as though in poverty is a criminal behavior. We're going to see higher arrests, higher incarceration because of that nexus between poverty and criminal justice, not because poor people are more criminal in nature, but because America over-polices the most impoverished. And so if we do not take this moment to look at how do we rethink, reimagine, engage in budget justice, and make sure that the recovery centers on the lowest income and not cutting them and their services and critical supports because the city doesn't have the money, if we don't focus on that, we're going to be in a worse off situation. So my thinking strategically is that you try to build a recovery that brings everybody up. Yes, you try to figure out how to support businesses. So as Kathy said, they don't leave the city. You don't try to balance the budgets using just them to do it, but you try to figure out how you bring everybody else up. And I think we need to look at how our budget is structured at the present time and figure out where we can make shifts. We called for the defunding of the police and reinvestment, but we didn't look at the other critical areas and spaces as well.
Sandra, you talked earlier about a very important point, which is that some of what we've seen in this crisis is just the revelation of longstanding problems and crises, race and poverty and other forms of inequality. And you also talked about some creative solutions that you've thought about, introducing more economic democracy. Let's talk about some new ideas, including those. What do you think is relevant now to put on the table with the crisis the city faces in terms of new ideas?
Yeah, definitely.
So I'm just going to jump in here and say that I think we can have a combination of new ideas and ideas that have been around for some time, but never really tested and never really invested in, right? And so, I'm just being honest. We know that there are policies out there that work for individuals and families, but we've never made the true investments in them. Things such as a livable wage. And I'm speaking mostly from my vantage point, looking at what does it really mean to provide tax credits to the lowest income individuals and families. Perhaps we should be looking at a disability tax credit, an older individual tax credit. Maybe we need to be looking at what it really would take to provide childcare for all people who are in need and not just, a fraction of the people who are in need, and how that can support people to get to work and to be fully engaged. So there are policies and programs that we know that work. The thing that I think we need to do here that we've never really done before, and that has even challenged this current administration in getting a handle on the recovery, is not really looking at what we need both economically and to ensure that everybody gets lifted at the same time. So we've got a problem right now, and I'm going to jump in on this because it's one that nobody's talking about, and it's driving me insane. We talk about the schools and the schools shutting down and whether or not the kids have tablets, iPads, whether or not they have the hardware. And then we talk about whether or not they have broadband access. But nobody's really centering on the fact that the children who are most in need more than a tablet, that they already were underperforming in comparison to, white, more affluent families. We're not talking about how white affluent families and Black affluent families have set up these pods, these learning pods that are helping their children to get ahead in these moments. And the education divide is further growing. So maybe we start there and we look at how we shore up the achievement gap, not just with tablets, throwing tablets at kids. We look at the mental health needs. I'm sorry, I could go on and on and on.
Yeah, those are good points. I want to bring Sandra in because I think her point in the program that NWBCC has talked about actually has an answer to those same questions. It's just a slightly different answer. So go ahead, Sandra.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with so much of what Jennifer is offering. I think those are really critical. We often have talked about a lot of those solutions for us, which we've been doing for 47 years, as defending and protecting our communities, right? And that's essential, that's critical, that's so important. And we call that the fight back strategies of fighting against bad policies or bad development or even bad landlords that are undermining our community. More recent, in the last couple of years, right, we've started talking about economic democracy, which is, this fight forward strategy of how do we actually build community ownership, shared wealth, collective governance over the assets of our communities. And some folks will say, well, maybe now is not the time to do that. We actually think now is the time more than ever, right? Because oftentimes, while these strategies of defending and protecting are essential, they're just really band-aids, right, on the issues that are impacting our communities. And what we need to do is get to the root cause. Why do these inequalities exist, right? And Jennifer really did point to many of those, right? So how might we, if there's a business right now, given the economic crisis, how might that business owner, we incentivize them to transition their business ownership if they're ready to retire to worker ownership, right? For worker cooperatives. How might we think about transitioning land and buildings into the ownership of the tenants or into community land trusts? So we put out a report on Friday that really talked about the community organizing that we're doing around community land trusts, which, if the audience doesn't know, really is about separating land from whatever goes on top, right? So you take land out of the speculative market. And so instead of making decisions around profit, you make decisions around health and wellness of the residents inside of those buildings, of those apartment buildings. And so for us, it's really thinking about how, especially now with a budget crisis, and we know austerity measures are going to come, who gets to make those decisions, and what are the metrics for those decisions? How might we actually simultaneously, to defend and protect, how might we also invest in addressing those root cause issues by building community shared wealth and ownership?
So Kyle, the old saying is, you never waste a good crisis, and it always seems a little raw to put it that way, and certainly in this case it would. But the fact is, the city does have this emergency, and things are going to change. You've talked about the fact we're never going to go back to normal. What do you think in terms of charting a path forward? What do you think are some moves we should make in terms of policy, in terms of business, that will help working people in the city?
Well, I don't think we should go back to normal, actually. I think that what has been articulated by both Sandra and Jennifer are spot on, that, that is part of what was normal. And we have to get away from that as well. We have to make sure that we shore up our communities and provide the what this crisis has done is pull back the curtain on the many disparities and biased outcomes for communities of color and low-income communities that we turned a blind eye to, unfortunately. And so I think that when I say back to normal, I mean I'm talking about our ability to attract and bring businesses back into the city. But we can't forget that we have there's been a disparity and disadvantaged communities that we have to again focus on. And if we really want to bring the city back, everyone has to be a part of the recovery, and it should be a worker-based recovery as well. I have confidence that there are many brilliant people in the city, and the brilliant panelists that are here this evening will lend their voices to what it is that's necessary for this city and state to recover. And I can't, it's been said way better than I can articulate it by Jennifer and by Sandra and by Jessica and Catherine as well, that this has to be a very broad-based solution to how we bring our city and our state back for everyone. Everyone has to win, and everyone can win, but it has to be a collective effort, and it has to look at the deepest disparities in this city and figure out how we cure that. And again, it's not just, as Jennifer said, it's not just throwing tablets at kids. It's not broadband. It's so many different aspects of how we expect the future of the city to look, and it's based on how we are allowing our next generation to succeed. And for my members, we'll continue to provide the essential services that the city needs, and we'll continue to be partners with our industry to make sure that the recovery that is being planned is planned responsibly, and that people feel comfortable again in living in New York and working in New York. And I don't buy into the fact that there'll be a mass exodus from our city. I think that people want to be here. They want to live here. They want to work here. But we have to work harder to make sure that it's an equal place, a place of equal opportunity for everyone who's a resident.
Just quickly, in terms of exodus, I was thinking about this the other day. I've taken some comfort in the idea that if anyone was going to leave, they would have left by now. Am I right? Is that everyone's gut feeling? Have you basically seen the the departure if it's going to occur? Kathy, what do you think?
I think not, because I think the issue that has actually been raised on the chat, the eviction moratorium has allowed a lot of people to stay here that otherwise would not or could not, depending on what happens and how we resolve it. And my biggest worry about the next year is how we're going to resolve that issue of the eviction moratorium, both for residents and for small business. I know many small businesses that say, if when that disappears and I have to come up with a check, I'm finished. That will shut them down. So I think that's kind of the elephant in the room that we don't have a public policy solution to at this point. And I think that's what we ought to be thinking about. I wanted to go back quickly and just say I appreciated Sandra's comment about the Band-Aid of defending and protecting. It's not only a Band-Aid, it's a negative solution where people are focusing on their powerlessness rather than what they can contribute. I think our only hope for recovery is an organic one. You referenced the 70s. I think I'm the only one at the table that was a mature, an adult working in the 70s on recovery. And we created, I come out of community. I was the first, back at the beginning of City Limits. And we created an infrastructure where communities were at the table. We created programs and they flowed from the federal government. And I have some hope that the Biden administration is going to buy into an urban community redevelopment commitment and process that where we can get resources directly to the community. In the last 20 years in the city, we've destroyed much of that infrastructure because we haven't had programs that were funding them. I mean, what community organization can participate in 421A, our largest affordable housing program? None is the answer to that. So we have an opportunity here, and we did this when the city was completely broke. We did have federal support, but it was thin. We had CDBG money that didn't go to that went to support community development activities. We had neighborhood groups that were like Northwest Bronx Clergy when I started them that were able to actually be the owner developers. We had home ownership programs where neighborhood residents that could move out of NYCHA housing into their own home for less than they were paying in rent, because we had those kind of efforts and gained an equity. So I think that's what we have to recreate. That's the opportunity. And that will really use all the assets, and that will rebuild trust between the public and private and nonprofit sectors. If the community's at the table, the projects that are working today, I was talking about like St. Nick's conversion of the old Greenpoint Hospital into community health facilities, housing, et cetera. They're doing that in partnership with the private sector. We're not just waiting for government to come along and save us. Community organizations can be actors and agents, as you point out, in making this happen. And I think that's going to change the whole dynamic and bring us back together if we can pull that off and create the right kind of policy and programs to support that. And the only other thing I want to say very fast, I think health and the human services solution that we've recognized during this COVID, human services is as important to the health of the communities they serve as the hospital is. And if we don't integrate those funding streams, we're going to continue to spend a huge amount of money on health with horrible outcomes, which we have been doing for the last 20, 30 years. We've got to be spending that money on an integrated health and human services community-based delivery system. We can do the same thing with less money if we bring these pieces together and we recognize the social determinants of health and the role they play in preventing things like the rapid spread of COVID.
Let's talk about the rent issue, because as the comment from Facebook says, it's a looming disaster, and I think Kathy highlighted that. Jessica, among elected officials at the state level, are there discussions about a real policy response to that, a full-throated, comprehensive response? Because that is hanging over us as early as the end of the year.
Yeah, thanks for the question. As state senators, we certainly have been having these conversations. There are a myriad of bills, not just, one to quote unquote cancel rent, which sounds kind of simplistic, but is actually much more complex and does offer opportunities to protect smaller landlords. I co-sponsor these bills. I don't carry any of them personally, but in Corona, Queens, here in my district, we are seeing eviction rates skyrocket. There is no actual moratorium on rent. There are people being taken to court. There are people who are being wrongfully evicted. Too many people don't know what their rights are. For example, that a landlord can't change the lock on you. They have to have a court order. Only a marshal can do it. A lot of people think that because they're undocumented, they don't have any rights, and a landlord is ready to evict them tomorrow. I've seen many of my undocumented neighbors go back to their home country during the pandemic as well. But more than that, I've always been concerned with the amount of working class people who leave New York because they can't afford to keep up with the cost of living, much less be able to realize their dream of buying a home here in New York City. I mean, I have cousins my age who grew up here, works for Amtrak, had to move to Connecticut because he couldn't buy a house here. And that's, not a special story. Many New Yorkers have ended up in Pennsylvania, in New Jersey. And that's the tax base that I've been so worried about losing, because there are most solid tax base, right? We depend on the middle class to be the backbone of our economy. And yet we still continue to cater to those who actually have the most means and refuse to pay their fair share. Because we're supposed to be deathly scared that they'll leave. And I'm not saying that that's not possible. I'm saying that, I'm worried about the thousands of New Yorkers who are going elsewhere. And just in terms of keeping our neighborhoods safe and intact. Not only safety in terms of public safety, and in terms, which is a health issue, we need to protect our small businesses as well. Transferring a lot of those of these solutions that we seek for residential rent is also true for commercial rent, which has been skyrocketing. A lot of these small businesses are paying, have signed on to triple net leases that have them paying a lot, if not most, if not all of the property taxes for landlords. And that's what's digging them in. So we have a lot to do, a lot of our economy to restructure, and ensure that any New Yorker is able to keep making the boroughs their home. But more than that, every New Yorker should have the right to start their own small business. And we should be investing in those New Yorkers. We should be fomenting innovation and creativity. The entrepreneurial spirit is what New York's all about.
Jennifer, Sandra, Kyle, any thoughts on the rent question? Is this something that we can look for some sort of action by fiat by the mayor or governor, or will there have to be a revenue stream? What should we do come January 1st if there's no new moratorium in place?
Yeah, I really appreciate Jessica's comments, because we're a part of the Housing Justice for All coalition, which is statewide. Thank you for being a sponsor of those bills. We are looking for rent cancellation and a real eviction moratorium. As the senator was suggesting, folks are still being evicted. The current eviction moratorium that's in place right now requires documentation from tenants to show that they have lost their employment. If they have a reduction of income, that might not be sufficient, and it's up to a judge to make that decision. And so we are, those are really critical policies that we're putting forth, including a housing voucher program. I'm thinking statewide of what's critical in this moment. So that for us is essential. And I want to affirm the senator's request and thinking about how might we tax billionaires for revenue generation. I agree with Catherine that there are multiple ways to generate to revenue, and we have to be creative in this moment. But I do think that one of them needs to be taxing the rich. And we were really afraid when we were proposing increasing the minimum wage in New York State that would devastate the business community and that they would leave. And we know that's not true, right? We know that was really critical for workers, for their livelihoods and their families, and that did not push ultimately the business community out of the state. And so here we think now it's time to have a more holistic approach to how we might address these issues. And one of them must be around those that have more in this moment support the rest of the state.
So let's turn to the mayoral campaign that is obviously very much underway and will become a bigger and bigger part of the political picture in the city over the next few weeks. We have a very wide field of candidates for mayor. It may grow more. Given what we've been talking about tonight and some of the deep, deep threats facing the city and some of the opportunities that are out there, if you were a panelist at a debate and had all the candidates in front of you, what's the one question you would want our mayoral hopefuls to answer that would give you some sense of whether they're capable of stepping in and helping to solve this crisis? Sandra, why don't you go first? What would you ask?
I would be looking specifically around their policies around economic democracy. I think for too long we have provided Band-Aid solutions across the board in every system: education, housing, health, immigration, criminal justice. They're all short-term Band-Aid solutions, and it does require in this moment for a mayoral candidate to think about, are they willing to co-govern with us? And what does that look like? Who gets to decide ultimately on how to develop policies? Who gets to be at the table where the budget negotiations are happening? And for us, that has to be community. It has to be community members that are at those tables, stakeholders that represent a larger base of people who are looking for an alternative, economic vision and plan for the city that is not just about attracting big business, but it's about lifting up the tide of all workers, and that reflects prevailing wages and reflects ownership of tenants and workers.
Kyle, what about you? If you were at a mayoral debate and could ask a question, given what your members have told you, what their needs are, what would you ask?
Well, I want to be interested in what their plan is to bring the city back with a strong economy, and I think it has to be, as Sandra had indicated, start with good jobs, family-sustaining jobs. We want to make sure that we have the ability to keep people here in this city. We want to make sure that they have a plan to deal with the police reform platform. Police departments enjoy consistent full funding at a time when other government provided social services are being cut. And we support audits, just audits. And we expect that those budget departments are not the money, the resources that are going to those police departments not used to continue to militarize those police force, which has been greatly impacting communities of color in this city. I'd like to see equality in how we create opportunities for people of the city. The thing about the pandemic is pull back the curtain on the many inequalities that exist across the city. We have to make sure that we find a place for the least of us. And I think that we really need to think about how we make this a city that's livable for everyone. It can't just be a city for the rich. When we signed on to the billionaires tax, and I think it's right. I think that we can't, whatever the policies come out, can't be another burden on the working people and working poor of this city. And the working poor, that's a term that we have to eradicate from our language. There shouldn't be any such thing as the working poor. People get up every single day and go to work, provide a living for themselves and their family, that they have to live under. This doesn't make sense. So I'd like to understand the plan that any candidate to run this, to lead this city, have to rebuild our economy, let it be worker based, and provide equity throughout the communities of it.
Thanks, Kyle. And I think you have a conflict and need to drop off. And if so, thank you so much for being with us, but stick around as long as you can. Jennifer, how about you? If you had this vast field of mayoral hopefuls in front of you, given what we've been talking about tonight, what would you ask? What do you think is the most important question someone who hopes to be mayor should have to deal with?
So I'm just going to quickly tell you that I'm having a little bit of difficulty hearing you clearly, but and hearing others. But I believe that you've asked me what am I looking for, or what am I centering on in terms of the mayoral hopefuls. Is that correct?
What you would ask them if you had them in front of you, but yes, same idea.
Okay. So I from what I was able to hear with respect to the comments given voiced by Sandra and Kyle, I share some of the same interests and concerns that they have, especially as we make sure that we recover as a city that is supporting everybody to not just get back to where they were, but to actually do better and get ahead. But I'm focused right now on looking at the character and you talked about capability when we first began, the capability and character of the people who are coming forward as mayoral hopefuls. Ideology, a lot of, some of them may check the box based on what they are saying from my vantage point, but I'm concerned about whether or not the next mayor or the mayoral hopefuls are educatable. And what I mean by that is we need in a leader someone who is not showing up at the table believing that they have all the answers, that they know what equity in New York City looks like, and they do not need to be helped to understand what equity in New York City must look like. We need somebody who maybe has leadership and management experience and acumen, but doesn't think that they have all the answers and they know how to do it best. I think some of our greatest challenges over the course of the last several years at the city, the state, and the federal levels is, and this is maybe the problem that is just inherent when it comes to politicians, say Jessica Ramos, is that we have people who want to, believe that they've been put in the position and they are the general manager and they get to decide who plays on the field and in what positions they play, and they know better than anybody else. And then we find ourselves with people who are not so effective as leaders in crises, as leaders and managers in everyday happenings. We need leadership, people who are educatable, people who have experience, knowledge, have a sense of what must be done, but they are able to be educated and will work with us as teams and not as dictators or, the person who sits at the top and can't hear the voices of others. So I'm clued into what they say they will do, but I'm also centered on who they are and how they show up.
Jared, can I jump back in?
Yeah.
I just wanted to add one more thought. Jennifer raised this for me early in the conversation when she talked about the healthcare disparities that exist in the city, and I would hope that we have a government that will look at the healthcare disparities that exist in the city, make sure that all residents have access to quality and affordable health. The city employs hundreds of thousands of people. And I hope that we have a mayor that will look at the system, look at the hospital pricing that is taking money away from the city that could be going into more social programs and figuring out how we provide access to these communities that have been devastated with hospital closures and other problems with accessing health. And so that's something very important to me that the next mayor would take a hard look at that and take a look at hospital pricing and how that money is being thrown out of the window instead of being redirected back into the city coffers with social issues that really need. So thank you, everyone, in my esteemed panel. It's a pleasure being with you. And Jared, thank you for the opportunity to be part of this great.
Thanks so much for being part of it, Kyle. Thank you. Kathy, to you now. You've got the mayoral field in front of you. What do you think is obviously there are a lot of questions we want to ask them, but if there were one that would separate the wheat from the chaff, what would you ask?
I would ask them how they're going to unite New Yorkers behind a shared vision for the future of the city.
Good one, and pleasing in its conciseness. Senator
So
Ramos.
can I just say, now I can hear you. So
Good.
whatever happened,
We're
now I
making
can hear you.
progress.
So in addition to all of that, I would ask them about what they're going to do about policing and policing reform. I think that that's a big issue, and the leadership has been, at times spotty and shaky in that area. And real
Well, let's stay
reform
with
can
that
only
because that's a very good question. What's the answer you want to hear, though? They're all going to have an answer to that. Bill de Blasio has had an answer for the past 7 years. What do you think the right answer is?
So I want to hear them talk about, I want to hear them own that racialized policing is a problem in New York City. And I want to hear them own, how it is many New Yorkers. I want to hear them talk. I want to hear the mayoral hopefuls talk about how they are going to oversee and help drive reforms, both from the bottom up and from the top down, but really ensuring true accountability and not scapegoating. That's what I'm looking for.
Makes sense. I want to take a quick break to introduce my esteemed colleagues for just a moment to send a message to the viewers who are tuning in, because this is a key time of year for City Limits as well as many other organizations. So I'm going to introduce to you briefly my executive director, Marjorie Marte, and the managing editor, Jean Marie Evely.
It's wonderful to be here tonight. Thank you so much, Jared, for this terrific evening. I think we've all so much have enjoyed it, and we look forward to hearing more from our panelists. For me, it's been an incredible whirlwind of 90 days. I've been here for that much time, and I've so enjoyed it, and it's just wonderful to be working with this incredible staff like our executive editor, Jared Murphy, who's bringing programming like this town hall virtual event tonight, and reaching out to foundations and donors like you to continue to support for this worthwhile organization. It is so important, and we so appreciate it. City Limits uses investigative journalism through the prism of New York City to identify urban problems, examine their causes, explore solutions, and equip the communities to take action. Our journalism strengthens awareness and engagement around civic, economic, and social issues in New York City. We leverage our investigative reporting, coverage, and op-eds as starting points for discussion around the key areas we cover to galvanize the public's need for action. We have the amazing opportunity to double every investment we get now through December 31st. Newsmatch will match every new monthly donation at the 12 value and double every one-time donation up to $5,000. With the support we have, the potential to continue our groundbreaking work. We need your support. It's so important for City Limits. Without it, we cannot continue this kind of work. We will definitely cover the pulse of New York. Your contribution will absolutely make a difference. Please continue to support this organization. Our reporting can impact and change the lives of New Yorkers for the better. I would like now to turn over this to Jean Marie, our wonderful managing editor, to talk about our exciting newsletters, Mapping the Future, City Vote, Una Ciudad Sin Límites, Voices of New York, and The Weekly, and as well as our prestigious youth program called Clarify. Jean Marie, it's your turn now, and thank you all. And I really hope that you will support us and continue to be there. And without that, we will definitely continue to do the great reporting that we're doing. So Jean Marie can talk a little more about that.
Sure, thank you, Marjorie. Hi, everybody. My name is Jean Marie Evely. I'm the managing editor here at City Limits. Thanks again for joining us tonight for this important discussion. As Marjorie mentioned, if you want to get even more out of our in-depth reporting, we'd encourage you to check out our email newsletters. We have 4. There's Mapping the Future, which brings you the latest stories about New York City housing and development. We have our Spanish language newsletter, which comes out every other week, as well as the Weekly, which brings all of our biggest stories from throughout the week straight to your inbox every Friday morning. We also have Voices of New York, which features stories from the city's ethnic and community news outlets, which were originally published in other languages and which we translate into English so they can reach a wider audience. Lastly, we have our election newsletter called City Vote, which you'll definitely want to sign up for to keep tabs on how next year's mayoral race is already playing out. You can find information on all of those newsletters and subscribe to them by visiting the City Limits website and clicking on the newsletters tab. Marjorie also mentioned one of our other initiatives, one that's very dear to my heart, which is our Clarify journalism training program. It stands for the City Limits Reporting Initiative for Youth, and we've been running it since 2014 for high school and early college students here in New York City, where they get a chance to learn the ins and outs of investigative reporting. They learn how to find and interview sources, track down data, do research, and write about what they find. So not only is it a paid internship, but it also gives participants a chance to earn a byline on an article published in City Limits. We consider it our contribution to helping train the next generation of New York City journalists. And with your support, we hope we'll be able to keep offering that opportunity to more young people. So please consider making a donation today if you're able to. Thank you again for joining us. If you have any final questions for our terrific panelists, please post them in the comments if you're watching on our YouTube or our Facebook page or on Twitter. We'll hope to get that to them as we wrap up the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Jean Marie and Marjorie, and thanks everybody for watching. And to our panelists, we have just a few minutes left. Thanks so much for staying on for so long. I want to talk about kind of the very practical issue. We've talked about the challenges facing the city, some of the ideas for maybe navigating it, the questions we feel mayoral candidates need to answer related to those. So the question now is, how do we make sure we have that kind of conversation? How do we get the people who are running for mayor to talk, I think, in some detail about things like Kathy's great question about how do you unite the city. That's obviously always a puzzle. Sandra, what do you think? Is there a way to focus attention on some of these kind of issues?
Yeah, absolutely. For us in the Bronx, it has been really critical to think about, how do we shape these conversations? I appreciated that someone mentioned earlier, Jennifer, I think it was you, that, there have been some good solutions in the past, and for sure, there have been that we just haven't fully invested in. Something I wanted to just kind of frame is that a lot of what was happening back in the 1970s, while they were helpful, especially from the federal government, solutions, they were also racist, right? And so they were not accessible to people in our community, and that is, for us, why we think our people, our voices need to be part of the shaping of the mayoral race. In the Bronx, we have developed a Bronx-wide coalition of organizations. We started it last year for the purpose of building a federal level platform. So we had nearly 30 organizations come together to think about what is this vision that we have for our borough, and looking at the systems and what does that platform look like? What are the solutions, the innovations, the investment that we're looking for? And we used it to engage the candidates in the 15th congressional district race. I'm really happy with the amount of voter turnout that we had despite the pandemic, and the fact that the candidates were forced to talk about the issues that we put forth that were important to our community, and we helped shape that race. This year, we're translating that federal level platform to the city level platform, and we're going to be engaging in candidate forums with all of the candidates in city council here in the Bronx, the borough president's race, as well as the mayoral and comptroller race. And so we want to bring those candidates to the Bronx with one voice. We want to talk about what our vision is, and we want them to respond knowing that the Bronx as a voting bloc can make or break them, and that we want them to be listening to what our vision is, which is grounded in racial justice and economic democracy, and be prepared to respond to that.
Senator Ramos, I'm curious, as someone who is an elected official and who talks to other elected officials, I'm assuming quite regularly, do you feel like in your heart of hearts and from what you're hearing from other people, is the political class in New York City and state, are they open to having a real conversation about some of these deeper ideas? I mean, is the courage and is the willingness there to embrace some of these, more difficult issues and to kind of get beyond sort of people's conventional comfort zone?
Well, I definitely agree that some elected officials have inherent political courage. But I also believe that political courage and political will can be created only by constituents and by the people. And this is why I like what Sandra had to say, is because it really is up to New Yorkers to create these spaces where the mayoral candidates or any candidate for any office ever is put in the hot seat and asked the serious questions about the future of our communities and what the person's vision might be. I think we're also seeing a proliferation of candidates who might espouse values that very much are aligned with many of us, but don't necessarily have the skill set or the ability to, work within the system, the existing system, and figure out how it is that you're going to build bridges towards the next level for our society. I think that it's been a really interesting time to see the political climate change. Of course, we all saw many more people become politically engaged after the Trump election in 2016. It catapulted many of us into office. There's definitely a wave that has taken place. And I think we're going to see it with the 2021 city elections as well, at the city council level, at the mayoral level, at the comptroller level. I think New Yorkers, being New Yorkers, we're very loud, we're very opinionated, we know exactly what we want. And it's up to us to just keep us informed, engaged, and keep the pressure on your elected officials to do what's right. I mean, as I continue to advocate for my issues, decriminalizing poverty in general, I continuously tell folks on forums with no qualms, feel free to figure out who your state rep is and give them a call if you don't see them sponsoring the bills that your community needs in order to make ends meet. It does come to that. And it's a little harder for those of us who represent communities where English is not our main language. But we're the ones who have to help thread that needle. And, not for nothing, Jean Marie mentioned it a little earlier. This is where Voices of New York and other publications like it become so critical, because otherwise our voices are not heard, right? The street vending issue is not a new issue in New York. It's an issue that's as old as time. It's as old as New York itself. There's been street vending. And yet the issue is finally seeing, the lack of action is finally seeing the light now because of the pandemic, because we're creating the political will, because we marched across Brooklyn Bridge last week. It takes us getting off our asses and deciding that we're going to roll up our sleeves and have these conversations and get to work. And if the pandemic doesn't open our eyes more than any Trump administration would have been, then I don't know what to say. I mean, we have to get serious about what type of city we're going to leave our children. I'm definitely committed to leaving a more equitable city for my boys, where they don't have to worry as much as I have. And that's what it's about.
Kathy Wild, political scientists generally divide the city's mayors into two broad categories. You have like your managers and your visionaries, which is a little crude, but generally that is kind of how it's broken down. The city obviously needs a great manager from 2022 on, but some of the things we talked about, including your great question about how to bring the city together, obviously require someone with real vision. Can we get someone with both, or do we have to choose between one or the other? And if we do, who do we go with?
Well, in terms of I think we obviously need somebody who can figure out how to keep basic city services running. So management skills are important, but you can hire those if you're a secure thoughtful person. You can get people who are expert in those areas to run. So I think the more important is somebody that's got a broad vision that encompasses all New Yorkers, that can turn our negatives into positives, that has a pragmatic approach to problem solving, but understands within that sort of the dynamic of what New York has been through and many New Yorkers have been through in the past decade, and particularly during the pandemic. And that leaves so many people so vulnerable. So it's got to be somebody that appreciates that vulnerability, but at the same time is willing to push everybody forward, and who understands what enormous assets this city has in its people, in its talent, in its corporations, in its communities. We've got this huge diversity of assets, more than any other city in the world. And if we can't make something out of that in a positive way, no one can.
And finally, Jennifer, for our last thought of the evening, among the assets that Kathy referred to are the people of the city, obviously, including folks who might be watching this live or watching the video later. We're facing this huge crisis on several different levels. We have this big election coming up in a matter of months. We're all just sort of individual cogs in that machine. But if someone is trying to make a difference, trying to be part of shaping the solutions for the city, what advice would you give someone sitting at home in terms of how they can be involved and what they can do practically to try to move the city to a better place?
So let me I want to quickly just comment on something Kathy just said. I'm sitting here and I'm smiling because one would think that I would just immediately embrace all that she said. And because she was saying we need somebody with vision. I too agree that we need someone with vision, but my concern, based on what I've seen just at different levels over the course of the last many years, is that you very often can put somebody in place with vision, and if they are clueless about who to put around the table, we will get nowhere. So I think that we need to make sure that even if you hire someone with vision, they understand what it means to hire and give the reins over to people who can really manage and run. That's a real challenge. What I would say to people, and what I today say to people, especially young people, is people know what concerns them. And today with the, with the internet, we have access to many different spaces and places that we otherwise wouldn't. Get involved by, jumping on the internet and researching and finding who is doing what you're interested in. There are many local, state level, and national organizations that speak to the issues and the concerns that many of us have. So do the homework, do the research, and then figure out how to get involved. There are many civic-minded organizations and people out there, but we don't, we're sitting back because we're waiting for somebody to come to us. So I think that people need to jump on to look at the resources that are available. Take advantage of City Limits and what it has to offer. Figure out how to educate yourself and then get engaged.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. Thanks very much to Kathy Wild, Sandra Lobo, Jessica Ramos, and Kyle Bragg. Thanks to Bo behind the scenes, Jean Marie and Marjorie. Thank you to all of you for watching. Please stay safe. Please tune in to City Limits. And looking ahead to next week, please have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Good evening.
Stay home for Thanksgiving, please. Thank you.